My name is Abby Pearson and I am a junior here at Waldorf University. I am majoring in history and receiving a minor in religion. My research this semester is focused on the slave trade in the Caribbean, but more specifically the Jamaican slave trade and how an overseer named Thomas Thistlewood kept a diary that recorded every day of his life, from his teenage years up until his death in his late 60s. There are over 10,000 pages of text which are all kept at Yale University, and they were unable to share the transcript with me being I was not a qualified historian. Luckily, many other historians have interpreted his writings and transcribed his diaries for people like me who want to study Thistlewood but don't have the time or feasibility to read 10,000 pages of his writings. This was my largest struggle as far as sources go, and there were some qualifications I could not answer due to not having his readings myself. My main goal of this research is to focus on the stories of the enslaved people Thistlewood wrote about rather than focusing on Thistlewood himself, as many other historians have done previously. In all of the sources I found for this subject, less than 3 of them were focused on the enslaved people who lived under Thistlewood's thumb. I want to look at Thistlewood's life in Jamaica from the lens of a black woman and not more common lens of a white man researching another white man. 2 of the most influential women in Thistlewood's journals were Abba and Phoeba. Both of these women would have been entirely erased from history if it was not of their stories being kept in Thistlewood's diaries. Abba was Thistlewood's preferred woman prior to Phoeba, who became what he later called his wife. Abba was raped and molested at a rate much higher than other women. During his 7 years of seeing her regularly, he raped her a total of 155 documented times. Why he ended up not favoring her after those 7 years is unknown, which is another reminder that these women would have been erased from history without the documentation that Thistlewood kept on them. Phoeba was valued differently than Abba in the eyes of Thistlewood. He rarely spoke about feelings or emotions in his journals, and he mainly wrote a record of the day stating the weather, sales, how enslaved people acted, if he punished them, and if it was an effective method of punishment or not. Phoeba was an exception for Thistlewood, as he wrote about his feelings for her when they were apart for over a year because Thistlewood traveled away from the estate that he oversaw her at. More notably, he called her, quote, a poor girl who was trapped in miserable slavery, end quote. This was rare for Thistlewood, and for comparison, he called enslaved people Negroes 3,166 times while only ever referring to them as slaves 55 times. His ability to have empathy for Phoeba shows that she had a special influence on Thistlewood that no woman before had ever had. Phoeba could speak her mind within reason to Thistlewood, and he called her, quote, too saucy on multiple occasions. The fact of the matter is that Thistlewood would regularly go to any woman he could find for sexual satisfaction, but Phoeba was a rare woman who gave him a sense of emotional fulfillment, and that brought a bit of humanity out of Thistlewood, enough that he recognized she was trapped in slavery against her will. By the time that Thistlewood died, he had written into his will that Phoeba should be given her own estate, her own land, and ultimately her freedom. Once Thistlewood died, we no longer have any historical evidence of Phoeba, which once again affirms my argument that without his writings on their lives, they would be entirely erased from history. There is an ethical dilemma around the diaries of Thistlewood that must be discussed. The argument has been made that Thistlewood's writings should not be accessible to anyone because of how cruel and wicked his methods of torture were. On the other hand, the argument is that we must keep his writings in order to avoid historical erasure of the enslaved people that he wrote about. I am on the latter side of that argument, where I believe it would be unethical to not have his text accessible because all of the men and women documented in those diaries deserve a story. Even without his writings, Thistlewood can never be forgotten, but we need his writings in order to remember every enslaved person mentioned within his journals. I have no respect, no forgiveness, and no understanding for Thistlewood, and I never ever will. But with that being said, I can still value his life because without it, multiple people would have been forever forgotten, and historically they would have never existed at all without his diaries.